Frazier. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier.
This should be the round of the century.
Look at Holyfield. What a warrior.
If he weighs 205, his heart weighs about 204. The fight. I can't believe it!
Unbelievable! Mr. Steele stopped the fight with fewer than 5 seconds to go. You're going to watch Lou Duva go crazy now. You're going to watch Lou Duva go absolutely berserk.
Hello Boxing Asylum listeners and welcome back to Punches from the Past, the show where we delve into boxing's rich history and talk about the fights that really mattered. I'm Steve, and joining me on the call for this Season 2 special is Andy Patterson. In previous episodes, you heard us going back in time to cover the likes of Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, Bernard the Executioner Hopkins and Felix Trinidad, Dwight Mohammed Karwi against Evander Holyfield, Carl Froch's 2 epic battles with Mikkel Kessler, a big Brazil versus Argentina clash between Acelino Freitas and Jorge Barrios, and the life and times of George Foreman and Ron Lyle. This time we travel back to a decade of top talent and climb to the very top of the sport to analyse one of the greatest boxers of all time. Walker Smith Jr., the man who later became Sugar Ray Robinson, and his opponent Randolph Adolphus Turpin met in London 1951 in a classic champion versus challenger encounter. Robinson had won the singular middleweight crown from Jake LaMotta just months earlier, while Turpin was the European champion. There was no easy defences back in those days, Andy.
Absolutely no, mate. If you look at like Robinson's career coming up there, we're talking about like people he fought, Kid Gavlan, great fighters like that, and they go into epic battles against Jake LaMotta. We all knew that Robinson was probably one of the greatest of all times. But before we do get into kind of like Robinson, because obviously you could talk about his career for like top to bottom, but when I kind of miss out his welterweight stuff and probably kind of go into the middleweight, but we need to talk about Randy Turpin first. The first of three, the youngest of three, brothers who incidentally all became champions in their own right. Randy certainly had it tough as a boy. At 3 months old, his father died due to injuries sustained during the Somme, due to gas attacks in the First World War. And at age 3, he contracted double pneumonia, almost died, and I think later on he also had a swimming accident which actually left him partially deaf. But you just need to think as well as it would be really difficult actually to kind of live in that area that he came from, kind of like middle class Leamington Spa. I believe the family was the first coloured family in the area who were actually mixed race. I think his mum was white. But in the end, he ended up going to the gym just like his brothers did. And at age 15, he was the British junior champion at 112 pounds in 1943. The following year, he won the British juniors again at 133 pounds. And in 1945, he won both 147 juniors and seniors. I just think, when he turned pro, the absolute bedlam this guy would have caused nowadays, his amateur record, just like domestically, ABA champion, he was like the youngest ever, I think it was at 17, the first black ABA champion as well, so he was basically like breaking down barriers and that as well. Even his brother, he did the same. His brother Dick, he was British and Commonwealth champion, the first black fighter to fight for the British title. The British board were basically forced into changing their kind of stuffy, kind of superior white man kind of attitude that they had at the time, and the Freed brothers were basically christened the dark threats, the British white hopes. It's incredible, but it's the same admission in that as well as by his own siblings, shall we say. Obviously I think we'll basically touch upon it that Randy was probably was deep lying issues there, maybe kind of like underlying issue of depression that was never kind of really fully diagnosed, because he was basically kind of considered a kind of bully of his siblings and his close family and friends and stuff. That would if he didn't do what he wanted, and that he would probably kind of end up breaking your toys, so to speak. But as I says, at that time as an amateur, Turpin basically coming through would be one of the hottest properties in the sport. And the press ended up naming him the Black Panther and the Bronze Tiger.
Like you say, he wasn't only fighting for respect in the boxing ring, and boxing, in a way, was a proxy for sort of gaining respect in his life. People, even ourselves, obviously, we're way too young for these type of eras. But he was, like you say, breaking down barriers. Even during the commentary from one of the fights, I can't remember whether it was the first one against Robinson or the second one. They were calling him like the young British Negro fighter, and always, referencing his colour and that. So the fact that he was having to use boxing to gain respect, and the more he knocked people out, as you say, they saw him as a threat, but they also saw him as a real hope as well, I suppose, for British boxing, which just goes to show he wasn't just fighting for respect in the ring, he was also fighting for respect outside of the ring. It must have been really tough for the young fella, and mental issues as well, possibly lying under the surface as well. You can't underestimate how difficult it must have been for him growing up in this time and trying to make his way in life, let alone in sport.
Definitely. I mean, was he really accepted, really, by, especially in the area that he stayed? As I says, Leamington Spa is, all intents and purposes, class is a kind of middle class area. And here, as I says, up camps, a mixed race family with three young boys, and says, in the day, he went on and achieved and beat one of the greatest names ever in boxing history. And basically, was he really ready to become a national hero at that time? I mean, think about it. Britain's really that far removed from the Second World War. I think it's 6-7 years. The
Mm-hmm.
country's almost bankrupt. After the war, it's dark, it's desolate. There's no really kind of a lot of prospects and stuff. And along comes, was there even any world champions at that time? I suppose you could probably say that we're always the kind of plucky loser. The Brits were always kind of known to go abroad, go to America, and get put up a kind of jolly good effort. So they'd say,
Yeah.
and then get iced maybe
Your
what
Don
five.
Cockles guy,
Yeah,
guys, yeah.
yeah, guys who were getting probably legit middleweights, like heavyweights, who basically went too far. And anyway, I think Randy ended up beating him actually light heavyweight for the title as well at one point. But yeah, but it must have been hard, especially in those days and stuff. I mean, if I listen to my old granddad talking about, like, say, those times, where that's the kind of era that he grew up in. They had to work, they had to do the dirty jobs, like down the pits, down the mines. Everything was about putting money, not putting money on the table, but putting food on the table. Didn't matter how you came about it. Every penny went towards putting food on that table, and that's all that mattered.
You mentioned the area that he grew up in. We are later in the show, in a special segment, going to speak to Sam Chatwin, who he's a Patreon subscriber. He's also been on in the past talking about his own Against the Ropes venture. He has a special sort of connection with Turpin. I know he lives in the same sort of area. He's got a lot of press clippings and old stories and that he's going to regale us with us later on in the show. So that should be good to learn about the type of area it was. And he has a lot of special insight into Turpin. So keep an eye on that. Obviously, Sugar Ray Robinson, so much has been said about him, Andy. One of the greatest fighters of all time, if not the greatest fighter of all time. You mentioned the fact that he'd risen up from 147, beating quite the names, quite the luminaries down there as well. He'd moved up as well. One thing that I thought was interesting, during the fight, you can tell that he does start to become tired, Robinson, and given his schedule, as well he might become fatigued, because this is a guy who's coming in one loss in 133 bouts by this point. 133 bouts. He was fighting, 2 or 3 times a month. In 1943, against Jake LaMotta, that is the only time he was beaten. And talk about gaining revenge over LaMotta. I think he beat him about 4 times after that. So you can pretty much mark that one off. It was well and truly avenged. But just in the months leading up to the Turpin fight, possible indicator about Robinson's physical fatigue. He'd had 6 fights across Europe in the preceding 2 months. And one thing that struck me about this, Andy, he'd travelled across Europe, like I said, in a couple of months or what have you. Back then, you're not flying around first-class aeroplanes and stuff, are you? He was getting on and off trains, planes and automobiles, you would imagine. No wonder the life must have really been taking its toll on Sugar Ray.
It must have done, mate. But at that point in his career, I mean, he was like the superstar. I mean, he's going to boot with big pink Cadillacs and stuff that promoters were actually insistent that he actually ship over to mainland Europe, as you say. he's fought all these fights against, like you say, he's been in Brussels, Switzerland, Paris, Germany. Then he goes back and he fights LaMotta, goes to Miami. He has another couple of fights, Don Ellis, and he decides to go back to Europe. And as I say, he's ended up fighting Kid Marcel, which I believe ended up fight was actually, I don't think he was actually paid for that fight. I think he ended up giving the money to charity or to some sort of kind of French milk fund, what it was called back in those days.
Okay.
About 5 days later, he goes away to Switzerland, probably by Bavarian Express, railways you say, maybe kind of semi kind of first class. And then kind of a couple of days later, or a couple of weeks later, sorry, he's back in Belgium, and then he's 6 days later another fight, just constantly going and going and going, and then before he knows where he is, he's living the high life in Paris. Some of the books now that you'll read, probably one of the good books that you'll read on Sugar Ray Robinson is called Sweet Thunder. One of the quotes I think was fantastic was that he left his legs in Paris before he fought Randy Turpin in London. But yeah, he defeated like some great, well-respected middleweight contenders like Holly Mims, who went the distance with some great fighters like Ruben Carter, Dick Tiger, Joey Girardello, Luis Rodriguez, who was I think Muhammad Ali was a big fan of his. I think he trained at the same gym down in Miami. But after beating them all, I mean, Robinson was basically, I think he became the third black man to appear on the front cover of Time magazine.
Mm.
Previous two were like Louis Armstrong and Joe Louis, so he was in good company there. So as he says, he undertook that tour of Europe, 7 fights, and he arrived by like a massive entourage. Bringing his trainer, his barber, his masseuse, golf instructor, playmates, and believe it or not, a dwarf. Did you read that one?
I didn't see that, no.
He brought along this dwarf to tell him jokes and stuff, and one time he was working on the speed bag, and he put the dwarf up on top of the speed bag. You know how it's got that kind of like overhang on top. It's on top of that, and Sugar Ray's punching the bag. It's absolutely it's fantastic, absolutely brilliant. So he's bringing all these suitcases, and there's like 32 trunks, luggage, and then 15 hotel rooms, and everywhere he went, man, it was this pink Cadillac convertible, which drove him to the fight. And then when, believe it or not, by contrast, as you think about this, you got Sugar Ray Robinson, you got Hollywood basically coming to a bankrupt UK, right? He's driving the boot to the Earl's Court in Kensington, London, with a pink Cadillac, right? And Randy Turpin goes to the fight on bloody public transport.
Yeah, post-war Britain, isn't it? People are struggling. They're looking for some kind of hope. And like you say, you've got the literal circus, midgets and all, which I didn't know about, coming into town, pink Cadillacs and what have you. The superstar of the day, really, isn't he? Not as avaricious, obviously, as the likes of a Mayweather, but in the context of his time, you've laid out a pretty, a pretty money happy scenario there. And I suppose he was getting really well paid, wasn't he? This was the biggest UK purse, Andy, ever presented up to that point. And even now, looking at the figure that Robinson was getting paid, reportedly, $84,000. No small chunk of change, especially back in what we're looking 1951.
Yeah, I don't know what that equates to nowadays, but it's a hell of a lot of money. Like, I mean, I dare say that would have been enough probably to retire back in those days, probably. Turpin, I think I'm right in saying this, maybe earns roughly. They say that he was supposed to earn $25,500, but if you kind of dig into the kind of some of the stuff in that, he apparently only earned £11,000.
Yeah.
With Jack Solomon apparently getting 38,000 off the back end of that.
Wow.
Incredible.
I was going to mention Solomon's actually.
Yeah.
Solomon's is one of the famous promoters, and no doubt one of the rich promoters. If you're mentioning things like that, he promoted many of British boxing's great nights, including Muhammad Ali versus Henry Cooper. Solomon's, inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1995. He died in 79. Did Jack, and he brought some great fighters to the UK. He was the, dare I say, Eddie Hearn, possibly Frank Warren of his day. 4-1 on favourite Robinson, just to bring that element into play. He wasn't expected to lose this, was he?
No, I mean, Turpin was a big, well, he's a high, there was like he's something like 25, 20-1 or something like that. It was just, you just think you this fighter, you say one defeat, and how many fights by this point? 150, what?
Robinson was 133 with one loss.
One loss. I mean, you say he's beat them all. He's cleaned out the welterweight division. He knew he was wary. Had to be kind of careful with Kid Gavlan. But you take out like people like Holly Mims, Jake LaMotta, Bobo Olsen, Joey Radon was a decent enough fighter as well. Charlie Fazera was really good. Guys of that ilk. This is before we actually got into kind of later half his middleweight run against like Graziano and before we even got up to light heavyweight and stuff. But of course he was going to be the favourite. In the day we just mentioned it, for example, that probably just the kind of British plucky loser, but just get into the fight, I suppose. You could just show for that first round that Turpin he wasn't afraid of him. He just basically kind of took it to him, let his hands go. Employed the kind of up and down style that he'd actually kind of used to really good success, and he's kind of come through his pro ranks. And he had that up and down style, good jab. But you could see that Leonard Robinson was kind of looking to kind of lead off a couple of left hooks, not off a jab and that as well. But I did think anytime actually you can see Steve as this fight kind of goes ahead and that, especially when it comes up close and it's kind of supposed infighting. It was quite dirty, a lot of rabbit punches behind the head.
Did notice that, yeah.
It's incredible, but it just the jab. I just thought like from Turpin, hold middle of the ring and that, and just kind of like trying to get kind of Shibari kind of step off. Perhaps maybe Robinson was kind of surprised by the strength and power, but then again, I suppose if you're kind of partying and drinking and dancing your way through Paris and stuff like that, which was rumoured to have done. But I did think he started the third one a wee bit more lively. But again, I say there were a lot of clinching, and you can see it as well as I think it was the third round that he kind of hurt him, Turpin with hurt Robinson with a leaping left hook. You could actually see that Robinson was looking to hold, and Turpin, for me, especially the early half of that fight, looked far more busier and far more stronger.
This is the opening round, and this is the round, of course, when the spectators as well as the boxers have a chance to study styles. This is a brilliant audience here. Half of Burke's peerage is on hand, movie stars, big politicians, and, of course, the rank-and-file fans, all wedged into the hall here, watching Randolph Turpin with his back to us. He has a white stripe down his trunks and the initials R.A.T. that can be seen there in the lower right. Turpin has a rather jumping jack style. He looks like one of those 10-cent store monkeys on a stick occasionally as he flexes his knees. The feature of this round is not only the referee cautioning them for a kidney punch here that Turpin landed on Ray Robinson, but the fact that Turpin showed absolutely no fear of Robinson. In fact, bullied him around and wailed him as if to say, I'm the boss in here.
Yeah, Turpin, he was younger, he was less experienced. The commentator mentioned the fact that he'd never gone past the 8th round. But I think all these things actually went in his favour. He was no respecter of reputations. He was almost as if he was green and naive enough to think, I can just go for this guy. I've got nothing to lose here. He had the whole of the, I wouldn't say the whole of the UK, but obviously, like you said, people were coming out to see Robinson in the streets, but they were getting behind Turpin. I've read newspaper reports from the day to say that the British public were getting behind Turpin, and they were looking at him in this fight in particular as one of their own. And he just went in from the start, as you say, attacking from all angles, and he set a frightening pace. And he was beating Robinson to the punch in the first couple of rounds. And it's interesting that you mentioned the third round there, because I thought it became very apparent in the third the stylistic issues for Robinson. He was cutting the mouth. He was being roughed up effectively at times. The referee was having to keep on top of both of them. Like you say, kidney punches, elbows, rabbit punches are going in. A lot of indiscretions. It was. But Turpin was doing what he had to do. And by that point, by the third, I noted that it looked like it was going to be a really long night for the champion by this point. Turpin had really established his authority by the first quarter of the fight.
Definitely. As I've probably said it 2 or 3 times, the jab was really stinging by Turpin. As I say, I think I maybe noted maybe in the 6th. I think Robinson actually had a bad swelling across one of his eyes. But I did say, especially in the 6th, I just think it was getting a wee bit kind of ridiculous. The kind of infight, and I say it was probably illegal. But in these days, back in those days, it was what it was. I mean, it was what I forget when the 20s before the standing count came in. You had to go back to a neutral corner, so to speak. But I just think if you look at it, Robinson, you say he did look heavy-legged, and especially in the 7th, it looked like he was kind of, looking like he was kind of landing a jab a wee bit more. But Turpin, to me, just remained resolute, just stood his ground, just kind of looked to kind of like sometimes punch with him. He was obviously, he had to be respectful of it, but the jab again, it was fantastic. Probably the kind of first time Turpin had probably been past. I think it was the first time being past 8 rounds.
Mm-hmm.
Into the 9th, still looked strong to me. definitely did still look strong in there. Again, the rabbit punch and the clinches continued, I suppose, and that. But both, I did think, were landing good, solid shots also in that 8th round. But it was the 9th round. But it was good to see that the fact that Turpin's gone past the 8 for the first time, and he's still looking solid and hanging in there with one of the greatest of all time.
Yeah, I can't pretend to have seen a great deal of Sugar Ray Robinson, but from what I've seen of him, it was all about jab, a lot about rhythm and movement. He loved to get into a rhythm, and once he got into that rhythm, that flow, it was very hard to get him out of that. And Turpin had done his homework. The commentator mentioned this as well. I think it was in round 4. Turpin had taken all the footage available of Sugar Ray Robinson. No YouTube back then. It would have been difficult to get hold of highlight reels, I suppose, to a certain degree. But he'd studied Robinson's style, his movement, the directions he was going in, and Turpin was looking to shut off his angles at every point. And the commentator actually mentioned how impressed he was by Turpin, by his strength, by his punch, by his output. You can't underestimate the strategy, because Sugar Ray was trying to make it a boxing match, but Turpin wasn't allowing it to become a boxing match. He was taking the fight to the champion. And Robinson, I've got it here in my notes, round 7, round 8, looking tired in the corner, slumping down on his stool. And then round 9, he was cut again from a head clash. He was already cut in the mouth as well. He was bumped, he was bruised. He was coming back into the fight, I think, by about round 9 and 10 and stuff. Maybe Turpin's inexperienced slightly. But, I mean, he'd put a lot of rounds in the bank, hadn't he, the challenger?
Yeah, because I just noted that as well, mate. As you mentioned, like round 9 in the 10th, I've just got noted here in the 10th, Robinson looked to kind of start the round a bit more busier, especially in the clinches and that as well. He did look like he was getting a bit more urgent. And Turpin, to me, didn't look as aggressive as he had been through the first 9. And then the right uppercut to the heart by Robinson. It really did have Turpin holding on at that point as well. So you could see it in the 11th round, the clinches and the output was almost non-existent actually. But you could see that Robinson was looking to be aggressive, trying to get, obviously he'd been the distance before. He knew what he had to do to try and pull fights out. But again in the 12th, Robinson was pressing it, but Turpin remained he was remaining tough, he was remaining durable, but Robinson threw some good combos at him as well. And to me, the 12th round was one of the clearest rounds for Sugar Ray Robinson in that fight.
Would I be right, or what's your opinion in saying, I think it was round 14, I have a question mark next to it. Robinson was looking really fatigued by this point. Would it be an overstatement to say that he was looking ready to go? He was ruffled, if nothing else.
What I've wrote for the 14th, Turpin pounded him with a left hook, and then Robinson remained game. It got a bit messy and the clinches, and Turpin looked to kind of impose his will a little bit.
Yeah, round 14, I really did think that he was suffering at that point. Back then, we're looking at British rules here. We mentioned Jack Solomons. He'd obviously put everything into play to try and get Turpin the victory, I suppose, even though there were immediate rematches back then. A great famous night was in Turpin's grasp. The referee was the sole arbiter. Yeah, there was no judges at ringside. Obviously, we're talking the 1950s here. Eugene Henderson was the sole arbiter. Looking on a few of the reports, I saw this on Wikipedia, so I did go and cross-check this as well. Even though the Associated Press scored it 9 rounds to 4 with 2 even in Turpin's favour, we weren't actually aware, even to this day, even in the press clippings and the online things that have been scanned, the sort of microfiche and stuff, an actual score to this fight, to this day, has actually never been revealed. Is that right?
I've got the score here, mate. I believe.
Oh, you do? Right, okay.
Yeah, the Associated Press apparently scored it 9, 4, and 2, and I had the score card up there. Just give me a second. I bloody had it there. Yeah, referee Eugene Henderson was the sole judge. Scored it 9, 4, 2 Turpin.
Oh, he scored it the same. There you go. Then, so I did search for that, couldn't find it. So the referee scorecard was the same as the Associated Press. Then
there they are. They put their arms around each other. Sugar Ray Robinson being escorted to his corner by Randolph Turpin. That certainly was one of the greatest fights of modern times, and there's the new champion. It's certainly one of the best I've ever seen as a sports writer. Both boxers deserve praise. Both were great fighters and great sportsmen. There's a deliriously happy crowd there in London, swarming around Randolph Turpin's corner. There's Sugar Ray, a gallant champion, even in defeat. He said, "I had no alibis." And the new champion, Randy Turpin. Good luck, Randy. We'll be seeing you in America soon.
Yeah, 9, 4, and 2. All in favour. Well, all in favour. Once in favour of Turpin, which I suppose again, Steve. I suppose it's a sign of the times, and that. I mean, I suppose if that fight had happened today, you'd have like people in the crowd absolutely having a good time, swinging Sweet Caroline and stuff like that. Whereas, you know, can you imagine like one of your middleweight champions nowadays getting serenaded with Sweet Caroline? Whereas back in those days, when Randy Turpin won the title, they actually serenaded him with "He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Big crowd too. 18,000. $250,000 gate was produced, which is no mean feat back in the day there. I suppose, yeah, I have a clip here. I have no alibis, said Sugar Ray Robinson. I was beaten by the better man. It was a huge upset. Finally, on the road, he was defeated. First defense of the middleweight title, as we mentioned. Even though he'd won it, he'd had like 6 non-title contests in between. They didn't mess about back then. Also, the rematch. I don't know whether there was a rematch clause or
Yeah,
what
there was.
the contractual agreements were back then. But it was sort of, they fought that many times, Andy. It was sort of expected that you were going to go straight back to it again.
Yep, definitely. As I say, I suppose we could maybe mention. I suppose Sam maybe would lay reference to it when you speak to him, mate. That probably at this point, this is when Turpin had a wee taste of the power. Obviously he became an instant, money maker for like his manager George Middleton and Jack Solomons and stuff. You had this precocious talent coming on onto the scene as an amateur. Probably one of the greatest fighters at that time, in Britain, and to get him to win the world middleweight title against Sugar Ray Robinson was absolutely incredible. They actually held a civic reception for him at Town Hall. He was presented to thousands and thousands of people outside City Hall. Um, we can get on to something else at kind of a later date in that, but there's at that point there was only a kind of a small plaque actually installed inside City Hall, but some people actually believe there was other reasons as to why there was never a statue kind of erected at that time. But as you say, the Robinson rematch happened pretty quickly actually, because at that time it was called the 90-day return match. It's actually illegal. It's actually an illegal clause now. Actually, I believe nowadays. But it was actually rumoured that upon arriving in America that he'd met a woman who Randy by name, Randy by nature, obviously for what for what I read anyway. Obviously he was married a couple of times, and I believe at one point he'd even threatened to commit suicide after breaking up with a girlfriend. At one point, he'd apparently drank some disinfectant. Survived that,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as I said, Jack Solomon actually, as we mentioned, was like probably the Eddie Hearn Frank Warren's time, but he had to do some business with the mafia at this time as well to try and get this rematch made. But he'd actually stated that in the press that for a British fighter meant paying a slice to the mafia. So for the rematch, Turpin was reportedly to have earned something like £70,000. Solomon somehow, amazingly, I don't know how, earned over £130,000. That is incredible.
It is quite bizarre, isn't it? Because you would think obviously going by, today's sort of standards, you would think to yourself, right now Turpin's got the title, you would expect him to be calling the shots, and maybe you would expect the rematch to be in London again, and he would be the main man. But the fact that you look at the crowd in the rematch in the Polo Grounds in New York, obviously a famous venue back then. I remember talking previously, the likes of Pancho Villa and that were fighting there as well. So it was obviously a recognised stadium. Over 60,000 were bought in. You start to realise now that Turpin, obviously, it was financially viable for him to go over there. You're looking at the gates of $750,000, movie rights, theatre rights. They're talking about, like you say, Sugar Ray Robinson, even though he was the challenger, there was still getting a huge share of the pie. I'm sure it was financially, economically viable, wasn't it, for Turpin probably to go over there?
Oh, mate! I mean, as you say, $750,000, 61,370 in the stadium. It's actually it's a no-brainer. I mean, just as a matter of record, actually, I came across. I don't know if you've actually seen the documentary "64 Day Hero." George Middleton actually was speaking to the investigator. And looking at the video, I would say this was made roughly around about the mid to maybe early to mid 80s. So as I say, Turpin's probably reportedly to have earned £70,000 for that fight. So at that time in the mid 80s, was estimated roughly about £500,000. It's absolutely incredible, match of money, as I say. But yeah, but Robson's share for the rematch was 30%, which is about 230,000, and as I say, Turpin's was meant to be 25,000. So that was reported as like $210,000 approximately. Loads of celebrities at ringside, naturally. We've got to be see Sugar Ray Robinson, none other than the one war hero, Field Marshal Douglas MacArthur.
Mm-hmm.
Medal of Honor winner. So it was all set up. I think deep down, I don't know if it's maybe the Bobby Olsen fight as well that I'm thinking about, but I just think maybe training wasn't as what it should have been. I mean, Turpin actually took off to this castle in Wales, set up camp there, in front of thousands and thousands of people who were paying in to get in to see him and stuff. And he's probably not getting any money for all that stuff and that, but. He flies into America, as I says, he gets hooked up with a woman. So as Mickey says to Rocky Balboa, women, they weaken those legs. But I don't know what you think about the rematch, Steve. Obviously, there's limited footage and time frame that we can actually watch. I mean, I watched an 18-minute video of this, so I don't know what you've managed to see the fight. So it's probably not been the full rounds we've managed to watch of the rematch either, is it?
No, very little, similar to you. The observations that I did make from what I got to saw, a lot of clinches in the rematch, similar to the first one. A lot of stifled action. I thought Robinson got hit a lot in the rematch. Obviously, in the first fight, he got hit a lot too. But I mean, to say that he was hitting a decline at this point would be disingenuous. We had a lot of great wins left in him, but you do start to see the losses start to sprinkle throughout the career. So you do wonder whether this was a sort of line in the sand, a turning point. Whether he hit the tipping point in the first Turpin fight. Even though he won the second one, he was very steadily starting to decline at that point, and he was getting hit a lot. Obviously, the finish was a strange one. And one thing I did want to reference, and I'm sure you noticed this too, a few people have mentioned, even in the newspapers at the time, which I've been fishing out in work actually, Ruby Goldstein, the referee. A lot of people have claimed that he was maybe too slow to intervene in the 10th round whenever Turpin was taking a lot of shots on the ropes. You know where I'm going with this. Mm-hmm. This was the same guy that also refereed the Emil Griffith, Benny Parrott fight as well, which was obviously ill-fated as well. Was it just, the nature of the beast back then? They sort of weren't too quick. They wanted to make sure that you were certainly knocked out, no more, no less at the end of the fight.
Yeah, I suppose that, but I've actually seen a kind of slowed down version of the stoppage. And that now, I will say that he was dropped very heavily, obviously with the right hand. He kind of the way he fell down was just like there was nothing left of him. But he did get up. He did show some good defense. But if you look at the kind of slowed down version of that video, Ray Robinson actually missed quite a few shots. Now the finish is solid enough. There was punch. I'm not saying he missed a lot. He missed every punch, sorry, but. The finish, he did get the punches home in the end, but before he did get those final shots home, he did miss quite a few shots before that. So I think the referee probably did get it right in the end.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm sure Robinson said to himself afterwards, his eye got cut, he was do or die, and you could definitely tell that the cut was bad. He knew he was a man on borrowed time, and like you say, I thought he was a bit wild at times trying to get the shots away, and Turpin was ducking and diving, but then when he landed those clubbing blows at the end, they certainly did that land, but he was someone who really was racing against the clock at that point, wasn't he? Because he was either going to stop Turpin or he was going to get stopped himself because his facial damage was quite bad.
Yeah, he's actually quoted saying after the fight, he said, after I got my eye cut, it was do or die. I didn't want to take the chance of the ref stopping the fight. I don't know if he'd headbutted me. Yes, he hurt me several times, but not in the 10th. I knew I was bleeding badly, so I just waded right in. That's exactly what he did. He said, obviously, we'd have seen it better in colour, but you could actually see part of the eyelid. I don't know if it kind of hanging a little bit, actually. So, the referee was probably within his rights to be making to stop that fight, or a doctor even, but no, he's come out there and he's absolutely just done Turpin beautifully with that right hand. As I say, the follow up in the end, he did get the punches home, but he was up against the ropes, Turpin, but quite a few of those shots did miss.
Yeah,
Turpin actually even disputed that stoppage after the fight,
which
was I thought it wasn't probably fair at that time.
Yeah, Randy Turpin, he had his back to the ropes. He was taking some flush shots from a desperately swinging Sugar Ray Robinson. He was stopped, though. He was cut and in need of a finish. Sugar Ray Robinson, like all the great champions do, found the finisher. We're looking at the scorecards here. Ruby Goldstein, the referee, who was one of the judges, had it 4 rounds apiece. Joe Agnello had it 5-4. Harold Barnes had it 5-3. Yeah, it was all in and around that sort of 4-4, 5-3 type of region by most of the guys there. I suppose moving on then, we'll go to Randy Turpin first of all. I mean, it's a bit of a sad one, isn't it, I suppose? You mentioned the Don Cockle fight. He did move up in weight to fight Don Cockle for the British and Commonwealth title. That was just a couple of fights later, actually, in 1952. Beat Cockle. Just looking at the record, went in with Bobo Olsen, another guy that we mentioned, Carl Bobo Olsen. I'm going to mention him in regards to Sugar Ray Robinson's career as well, as shortly. And then Turpin went on the road, as they tended to do back then. And I tell you what, he was still getting good wins, Andy, even the British light heavyweight title and stuff before he eventually retired 1964. The Valletta, I'm assuming that's Malta, he beat a debutant. And as you mentioned, Dark Forces, mentally and stuff, it wasn't really quite there. I read somewhere that he was struggling out of the limelight, wasn't he, when he eventually hung up the gloves?
Yeah, mate. I mean, if I can, I'll just mention quickly a wee bit about his kind of later career and that. But obviously, seeing him go up to light heavyweight and the way he dispatched Don Cockle it was quite emphatic. It was. I think even after that fight, actually, he immediately challenged Ray Robinson for a third bout. And he might even called it Joey Maxim at that time as well, as he says. The Olsen fight that I'd actually mentioned before, and I would probably say after the Olsen fight was probably his decline. His peak years were beaten out of him in that fight. Some people did say that privately he didn't want the fight. Friends and family didn't know what was wrong with him. According to them, anyway, that's they're on film saying that. So I think I can say that, or I can be allowed to say that at least. And apparently during the fight, his brother said that he wanted out of it. He wanted out of the fight during it. He said after the fight, apparently he was passing a lot of blood, and he was apparently later arrested for an alleged assault, which was then later withdrawn. At age 25, many thought he was past his peak. He got married. He went away to Rome. And he got beat off. He stopped in one round against a guy called Tiberi Mitri in 1954. And I don't know if you've seen it, Steve, but he got iced in that fight. It was a bad left hook from.
No, I haven't seen that one. No.
You need to see it. It's a bad left hook right behind the ear. Just absolutely ices him, drops him badly. Loses European title. He's out the ring for a year. There was rumours about eye problems. His reflexes seemed poorer. He'd taken a lot of punishments. I say the Bobo Olsen fight was probably the kind of his peak years ended by that point. But he won the British and Commonwealth titles, it says, against Alex Butt in 1955. October 1955, he then got beat off Gordon Wallace. Basically he got caught with a right hand and basically made to kiss the canvas. Obviously, in the next 3 years, he'd went like 14-2, 12 knockouts, got stopped once, and he won the British outright at 175. And then he went up. Just one of these fighters, I think, Stevie just went on too long. Obviously, chased the money, made bad investments. According to his family, anyway, they'd help run businesses for him, but some of these businesses were they were just too much. They were too big. He was losing money. People then were were due him thousands or asking for thousands of asking for handouts and stuff like that. He would then end up chasing the money up.
He ran a pub, didn't he, at the time, I think?
Yeah, I think in the end he ended up running a kind of cafe and gave it to his wife to kind of end up running and stuff like that. But he was kind of, in the end, he was left to run his own businesses, and then it was at that point he noticed the haphazard management that he'd done, and in the end he was forced to sell businesses at massive losses, and that's probably what's kind of forced him to kind of keep going. Probably
things got particularly dark at the end, didn't they?
It really did, mate. I mean, after that Pompey defeat in 2 rounds and that, he was out the ring for close to 5 years. He had 2 more fights in 1963 and then 64, both against debutants, and I think one was actually unlicensed in the UK, another one actually took place in Malta. And it was around about this time in that he was divorced, the investments, the cars, the gifts, the loans, etc. So the money just was gone by this point. Eventually ended up the scrapyard at 30-year-old. Think about it, at 25, he was fighting Carol Bobo Olsen, and at 30 he's working in a scrapyard, broke. Apparently he was due the rumour was at that time was £100,000 he was due to the taxman, and he had absolutely no potential to kind of pay it off. So he got an appeal in, and the appeal dropped it to £17,000, and even then he couldn't pay it off. So he was forced to basically again, broke, depression. He badly wanted to pay it off. It was driving him nuts. There was rumours that Jack Solomon maybe involved in threatening him. There was rumours about three attempts on his life. And then at age 38, he shot his daughter, then shot himself twice, once in the head and once in the heart. The daughter survived. Apparently, at his funeral, actually, the Reverend Halston gave the following eulogy as well. He says, at the height of his career, Randolph was surrounded by those who regarded themselves as friends, but was deserted by many as he lost his position and money. The fickleness of his friends and the incompetent advice must have weighed so heavily upon him that he was forced to desperation. Randolph was a simple man, a naive man, and he needed friends to protect him from the spongers. To our shame, he was let down. The tragedy is not his failure alone, but the failure of our whole society.
The deserting entourage, how many times do we hear that sad tale in boxing?
Yep, I suppose I remember when Mike Tyson got roasted once, mate, on TV, or it might be Mike Tyson's actual own words. When the money goes, so do the hoes.
Exactly. There's so many examples of that in recent years, like Riddick Bowen, that, you're looking 30,
Yeah.
40 back slappers clapping away before the fights. And then as soon as the money runs out, they all disappear. No doubt Sam shortly will be able to go a little bit further on the Turpin story, but it's definitely a sad, dark tale. Leading into Sugar Ray Robinson, what he went on to do, I want to use Carl Bobo Olsen, actually, Andy. We've mentioned his name quite a few times as a reference point, if you don't mind, as to how great I think Sugar Ray Robinson was. The first time I became aware of Carl Bobo Olsen, who was a Hawaiian fighter. He was one of the early fighters to actually get tattoos. On a side note, he had them all down his arms, the old green Indian ink tattoos. But anyway, I remember Neil Finn, I think it was, the boxing historian, wrote a special feature piece in Boxing Monthly in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was sort of getting into the sport as a hardcore, and I sat and read it, and it went through Olsen, how tough he was, all the amateur fights he had, how he gave the world champions great fights, and all the guys he went in with, and blah, blah, blah. And he is just one of these footnotes in Sugar Ray Robinson's career. And the point I'm trying to make here is, it just shows how great Robinson was, Andy, that we're looking at guys like Olsen's and even, your Ralph Joneses and all these type of people, and they are stories within themselves. They are great fighters and great champions within themselves, and they have such a high standing in the sport. And for Robinson to have picked them off one by one by one by one over nearly 200 fights, for me, exemplifies what a great champion Robinson was.
Just thinking of it as you're just talking about those fighters now. Every one of those fighters could potentially have their own book or books written after them. As you say, Graziano, those great fights with Tony Zale, Joey Maxim, who Robinson actually was forced to retire and actually ended up retiring from the ring for 3 years after that fight.
Mm-hmm.
He gave so much. Bobo Olsen, as you say, and then that Graziano knockout was absolutely incredible. But the way Bobo Olsen was a very, very clever fighter. Very, very talented. He was very he was called, I think somebody called him personable in nature. Very, very tough. Good puncher. And then I don't know if you remember this one, Steve, when Robinson dropped. I think it was maybe the third fight between the two. He drops him with a left hook in the fourth round. Absolutely, and basically, I think he just basically steps back. It's a check left hook, knocks him out. I think it's the fourth fight. Could be wrong because he got knocked out in the third fight as well. But you
Yeah.
see, like Rocky Castellana, Gene Fulmer, Carmen Basilio, Paul Pender, Gene Fulmer,
Holly Mims.
Holly Mims, Denny Moyer was obviously, I think him and his brother. Terry Downs was, I think he was one. He was British. Ralph Dufas. Honest, Joey Giardello. By this point, Robinson's way past his peak. Way past his peak by this point. But bit like Randy, he had his own investments and stuff. 1948, he'd owned property outright in New York, especially in New York. Actually, he had two houses in New York and one in Cleveland. A 15-room private house in the Bronx, restaurants, etc., bars. As I says, people probably at that time, why do you need to keep fighting if you've got all these businesses and stuff like that? End of the day, Robinson, bit like Randy, just spent all the money. The entourage doesn't come cheap, as he says. He's shipped his own cars abroad. He's booking like 4 levels in the hotel for his entourage and that sort of stuff. Obviously, the money was going to collapse. But it was actually around about the time, I think it was around about the Joey Maxim fight, when he's got that 3 years off. And we've also got to mention the dark side of Sugar Ray Robinson as well. As we spoke about Randy Turpin, that there was bouts of depression, potential domestic violence, stuff like that. By Ray's wife's own admission, she admitted that he slapped her about, especially around at that time after the Joey Maxim fight. He's 3 years out the ring and stuff. He's probably bored out his wits. Maybe he's got some brain damage and that. Who knows? Or maybe he just treats his wife like that. Who knows? But it was obviously he's forced to return. During that time, his financial empire's collapsed. As I say, domestic violence is obviously other women. It's Sugar Ray Robinson, for Christ's sake. Obviously, he's going to have women in every port that he fights in. As I say, 1955, he's forced to return. January to July, he went 5-1 with 2 KOs, beating number 1 middleweight contender Rocky Castellano, as I says beforehand, which set up the fight to fight Bobo Olsen to regain the title. And that's what he did. Just, I'll probably finish off by saying that you started with Bobo Olsen. I'll finish by saying that he came back after 3 years, 3 years off, and I think he fought, as I say, 6 fights, and then straight into the fight with Bob Olsen that same year. So for January to December, he fought 7 times and then regained the title in 1 year.
I might be butchering this anecdote just to finish, but I mentioned right at the top of the show that he was obviously born Walker Smith Jr. I believe that he wanted to box in an amateur tournament, wasn't old enough, borrowed his friend Ray Robinson's birth certificate or something so he could register as a boxer, and he was that good even at that age. They said that Ray Robinson boxes as sweet as sugar, something along those lines.
I believe you're right in saying that, mate. His amateur record, it's sometimes listed, I've got it written down here somewhere, as it's 85-0 with 69 knockouts, and apparently 40 of them in the first round.
That is absolutely amazing.
That's incredible. That is unheard of in amateur boxing, by the way, especially nowadays.
Exactly, as the great man himself, Ray Robinson, said, rhythm is everything in boxing. Every move you make starts with your heart, and that's in rhythm or you're in trouble. This is a story, though, of 2 great fighters, not just Sugar Ray Robinson, but also Randy Turpin. They went toe-to-toe in 2 fights, and there wasn't really, a cigarette paper between the 2 of them, I don't think, over the 2 fights. 1 win for Turpin, 1 win for Robinson. Both ended, unfortunately, as they often do in these old boxing tales, in tragedy, but 2 great fighters. We'll bring Sam in very shortly, obviously, to elaborate on the Randy Turpin story. In summary, Andy, any concluding thoughts from you?
I suppose, as I say, I would like to see at some point maybe kind of Randy Turpin get more recognition, because this is to become middleweight champion at that time. It was absolutely incredible. You couldn't even think about it. As I said, listening to some of the stories that my own grandfather would tell me about, kind of like the war years and what it was like afterwards and stuff like that. To have someone to kind of look up to. At that time, probably heroes are probably kind of like the word overusing that, but people always kind of lived their life through the kind of sporting heroes. The Americans had like some Babe Ruths and people of that ilk and stuff like that. Britain had nobody. As I say, we went abroad and we got iced. So coming off like a war that the country's beleaguered, and then Turpin kind of gives it a wee bit kind of breathe of life in that, and people kind of out celebrating. As I say, the whole town was out celebrating. It's a shame to see a guy who ended up broke. Who as I say, probably to see him, a fighter of that talent, with that resume, that record, especially the amateurs. He should have been set for life, and nowadays he would have been set for life. And it's a shame to see both actually end up broke, decrepit. In the end, Robinson, I think he ended up having dementia and stuff like that. And one of his best friends asked him, he says, "Ray, would you do anything different?" He says, "Absolutely not. I've had a wonderful life. It's been great."
Exactly, and that is as good a place to leave it in this first portion anyway. Thanks very much for Andy Patterson. Always great to hear the thoughts of Andy. Season 2, Episode 7 of Punches from the Past. We'll move on and hear what Sam Chatwin has to say as well on this great fight now. Okay, everybody, thanks for sticking with us. Steve here. As promised, we've got Sam Chatwin with us. He has been trawling through the archives, looking through the books, the microfiche, the newspapers of the day. And this is a specialist insight from Sam, who knows a bit about Turpin, being from around that area. Starting off, Sam, we're looking at the first Sugar Ray Robinson-Randolph Turpin fight, and a letter to Boxing News that you have there. A gentleman believed to say, I think it's fair to say, that Randy had no chance in this first fight.
Yeah, I mean, the reason this is quite funny, I think, is because, in today's world, anyone can just send out a tweet or whatever, or comment on Facebook and say, this fight is a joke, it's a mismatch. But in them days, if you wanted your opinion heard, you had to write to Boxing News or a sports paper of some kind.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, this is from TFG Jones of Utoxeter. May I take this opportunity of deploring the matching of our middleweight champion Randolph Turpin with Sugar Ray Robinson. At the moment, he is little more than a novice and has never been called upon to travel the full distance of 15 rounds. Randy is altogether too young and inexperienced to fight this Superman. Why should we pin our hopes on a possible knockout victory? But this is the only way he can hope to win, when in a year's time he should be a much improved fighter.
So it's just exemplifying how much of an underdog Turpin was.
Yeah. He was not given much chance at all. Robinson had been touring Europe at this point. I think they were calling it his Bummer Fortnight tour. He was just knocking guys out. But, there was a few people in the know that knew Turpin was going to be a tough fight. And, there was late money for him, apparently, leading up to the fight. Robinson supposedly wasn't really training. He was so famous and so mobbed. I mean, not much changes. The British fans, even now, mob their boxers compared to other countries and compared to America. And yeah, apparently Robinson was unable to really train properly. He couldn't really go out in public. So he was spending his days out in the country playing golf and playing cards deep into the night. Wasn't really taking this fight particularly seriously. Here's a bit about, this is in the book. This is a really good book, by the way, if anyone's interested, by James Morton. It's called Fighters, The Lives and Sad Deaths of Freddie Mills and Randolph Turpin. So you get the two stories of both men, which are both fascinating. But he says in this book, Robinson installed himself and his entourage at Windsor. Bang Bang Weber was his sparring partner and commented, "Ray's a gentleman and it's a pleasure being hit by him." There was also a dwarf in a blue tea vest and size 2 dapper crepe-soled shoes, as well as a French chauffeur. The dwarf's role in life was to tell jokes and, as part of the circus, to sit on top of the punch ball while Robinson worked on it. So you can just imagine that. What work? Just, good work for a dwarf, that. Just sit on top of the punch ball while Robinson hits it.
Well, I was going to make comparisons with when Mayweather came over against Hatton. It was obviously a free-for-all there, but I mean, Mayweather was the consummate professional right till the end, constantly in shape. So there's not really a parallel between him and Robinson there. And also, if Mayweather had brought a dwarf along to sit on top of a punch ball, that would have been quite the spectacle.
Yeah, that would have been amazing, wouldn't it? I don't know if you'd get away with it now. I don't think Mayweather could get away with it in the current era.
Yeah, political correctness back then maybe wasn't as tight as it is now. Yeah, exactly. But I suppose we were talking off air then as well about Randy Turpin, and Andy did touch on this, but I want to get your take on this. Quite a bizarre turn of events where Randy Turpin, I believe it was after weighing in, he couldn't find accommodation, and you take up the story, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, just to put into context, this was an absolutely massive fight. Everyone in the country was talking about it. It was on BBC. Earl's Court, it holds 17,000, and there were 51,000 ticket applications within the first few days. So the tickets were gone instantly. I mean, they could have filled it 3 times. But yeah, on the day of the fight, I mean, Robinson, he was arriving in his pink Cadillac, with thousands of people round the vehicle as it crawled to the venue. Turpin, things were a bit different for him. He arrived more modestly. He came on a train from Leamington, weighed in, and couldn't get a hotel room. So he spent the entire day in the cinema with his brothers. So you can imagine that. This man's about to go and beat the greatest fighter of all time. He's 23 years old. It's he's in his home country, and he can't get a hotel room. So he's just sat at the cinema all day, waiting for the time to tick away before he has to go on the underground to Earl's Court. It's amazing.
It is bonkers. I mean, only in this sport, really. It makes me think of things like Howard Eastman sleeping on a train before he even started boxing. But I mean, this wasn't a lead up to anything. This was the night before. Like you say, one of the biggest upsets of all time.
Yeah. It just shows how humble where he came from, Turpin. I mean, he was mixed race, and there weren't really many mixed race families or any ethnic minorities in Leamington, especially at the time. I mean, if it says in the book about his childhood more, and I mean, put it this way: when he beat Robinson, one of the national newspaper headlines was "British Negro beats Robinson." That was the headline. It's just unbelievable.
Just shows what an outsider he was then.
Yeah, he came from nothing and just did something absolutely remarkable. It's a shame. You ask most people now, they won't know who he is. But at that time, everybody was talking about him. He was absolutely huge. All of the national papers were writing about his love life, and it was just like any famous person would be now. But now, he's kind of forgotten because it just was such a short-lived thing, his success. I mean, there's a documentary on YouTube. Once again, if you want to learn more about Turpin, there's a good documentary on there called 64 Day Hero, because that's how long he was champion.
Yeah, a lot of the time, guys maybe would forget about these type of fighters. That's why we do try to bring out. We did Lewis Schmeling as well. I mean, obviously, they're quite two high-profile fighters, but we do hope that Punches from the Past and that do bring these guys out into the light, especially like Randy Turpin, who's maybe overlooked by some of the younger fans as well. And I mean, when you're talking about age, Sam, actually, regarding the respective fighters going in, we talked about Sugar Ray Robinson. He'd been around Europe. I mean, I know they were fighting, 2 or 3 times a month or whatever back then. It was quite remarkable. But he was maybe starting to show his age. He'd been around for an awful long time. And comparatively speaking as well, you were telling me about the physical condition of Turpin, which was the other end of the scale. He was actually maybe doing things that were a little bit more forward thinking for the time.
Yeah. I mean, Turpin was only 23, which is, he'd never gone past 9 rounds in a fight. He was still very wet behind the ears, but he had a special trainer, which in these days would be considered like a strength and conditioning coach, who got him into, he's super fit. He was super fit and super muscular, very chiseled physique, which was quite uncommon for the time. And he was kind of ahead of his time as far as the whole training side of thing goes, when he was training and taking it seriously, because this was him. He basically peaked at that young age because the fame of about what was about to come, he was not ready for.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, as for the fight itself, me and Andy have done it sort of blow by blow, round by round. So obviously there's no pressure on you to do anything like that. A quick word on the actual fight itself. I know you're here to talk about before and after and bring in the stories and stuff, but I mean, it was a remarkable contest.
Yeah, it was just, Turpin was so much stronger and fitter than Robinson. It was so clear. He was able to bully him, and you could just see there was just such a difference in sharpness of the two. Turpin fought with such confidence and belief. You just can't believe, when you watch it, you just can't believe how relaxed he looks. I mean, when you think about how much pressure he must have been under in his mind about this is such a big opportunity. I mean, no one expected him to win, obviously, but to fight with such confidence against who was a guy who was already considered an all-time great. It's just remarkable. And he lands some hellacious hooks on the chin of Robinson. And this is where I want to, give Robinson some credit. His chin is unbelievable in the first fight. He takes some absolute bombs from Turpin and he stays on his feet. And despite the fact he clearly wasn't as prepared as he could be and he wasn't at his best, he took his beating like a champion and he didn't quit and he didn't moan at the end.
A champion as well, Sam. Sorry to interrupt you. That had had so many fights by that point. He wasn't a young man. He'd been in with Jake LaMotta, for goodness sake, about 5 times.
Yeah, well, I think he'd gone something like over 100 without losing until he lost to Turpin, and it was like over 8 years or something. He hadn't lost for over 8 years, and this is when he's fighting every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So this was just, for him to then have the humility to give Turpin credit and not moan, and it just shows what a gentleman he was.
Yeah, that really does put into context, I think, Robinson's personality and also the size, the enormity of Turpin's win. He put himself on the map. He put Leamington Spa on the map as well. Yeah. Big parade afterwards. And you were mentioning as well about the BBC showing it, which was no small fry back then, because I know we can get things dead easily nowadays with streaming and stuff. And even a few years ago, it was DVDs and that. But back then, when there was an event on, you only had 1 or 2 channels, didn't you? And everybody sort of would have been crowding into houses to watch these fights.
Yeah, millions tuned in to watch it. He was an overnight sensation. If you speak to anyone who remembers the time, your granddads or whatever, and the old boxing fans, they'll tell you, everyone was talking about this fight, everyone at school at the time. And, boxing was a huge sport back then. It was much bigger than it is now. It was the talk of every household. And yeah, the victory parade is just incredible. You can't imagine it happening these days. For Turpin beat Robinson, and he went to the Leamington Council House, and he was on the balcony. There's thousands of people. I think there was like 30,000 people in the street below, and they had an RAF fighter jet fly over them and do a victory roll as tribute to his win. Just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, people pick up world titles these days, and I don't want to sort of disparage anybody. Obviously, it's a great achievement to win a world title. But again, putting this, contextualizing this, you're talking about a guy who's so inexperienced comparatively, hadn't even gone past the 9 rounds, barely known from the, the mixed race background and all that type of stuff. And for him then to beat the one champion, there was only one champion, one title in the division, and a guy who, like you say, had reigned, for over 100 fights and that. You just put all this together, and it just shows, what the win was for Turpin, how big it was.
Yeah. Another bit of good viewing on YouTube is there's an ESPN special on the first fight, and they have 2 of their analysts on, old boys. I can't remember their name, but they talk about their memories of the fight, and they say how when they were watching it, everyone felt the same, like, okay, Robinson's losing clearly, but he'll knock him out in a minute. It's coming. Another round goes by. Okay, Robinson will wake up in a minute. Yeah, he'll get him. He'll knock him out. It never came. That the Robinson they were expecting never came. Turpin just stayed in control.
And after the fight, he didn't take Randy Turpin long to dust off the gloves again, did it? Tell us about that.
No. So the fight was on a Tuesday, believe it or not. Back in those days, they'd fight any day of the week. 4 days later, this is from a quote from my book again. At the weekend, Turpin was back boxing in Mickey Keeley's booth. He had agreed to appear and he honoured his agreement. It may seem incredible that the world champion should appear at a booth, but that was something he really liked. Now, £20 was offered to anyone who could stand up for 3 rounds with Turpin. No one could. So often, well-known boxers, or not even well-known, they'd appear at fairs in a booth where there'd be a little ring and everything, and people could go in and fight them, like sparring, just to see if they could beat the boxer, basically. And it was just a bit of fun. And yeah, Turpin, so 4 days after beating Robinson, he was making small amounts of money again in this booth, just fighting random people who wanted to try and knock out the champ.
Yeah, it's quite a bizarre situation. Hopefully, Turpin got all the money that he was owed. As me and Andy touched upon, obviously they went on to fight a second time straight away. There are a few points of interest that I want to cover on the rematch, Sam. First of all, let's talk about the issue regarding the referee and the stoppage itself.
Yeah, well, at the time, the stoppage was considered a little bit soft. It wouldn't be in today's era. It would be considered. I mean, I watch it now and I think, yeah, he was out on his feet. But back then, it took a lot more for a fight to be stopped. And it says in the book again, there was a small cloud over the contest. Over the years, there'd been a number of fatalities in professional and amateur rings in America. At the end of August, George Flores had died in a contest at the Garden after being knocked out in 46 seconds of the final round by Roger Donahue. Anyway, that was not long before the second Turpin-Robinson fight. And although it was a close fight, and leading up to that round, the final round, I believe it was at the 8th round, he gets stopped in. No, it's the 10th round.
No, 10th is 10th.
10th round. So leading up to that point, it's very close on the scorecards. The referee has it even. And there's only 8 seconds left in the round. And he's up on his feet. He's still standing, but he's taking a lot of punishment from Robinson. And the referee stops the fight. Now, Robinson and, his team felt aggrieved. They felt it was stopped too soon. He only had to see out the round, and they thought he would have, because he was coming on a bit. And until that round, he was coming back into the fight a bit. Turpin,
yeah.
So, but the reason they believe it may have been stopped then is because the officials were concerned about another, because there'd been a death a few days before.
Yes.
And it was on their mind. They did not want this. This was a massive fight. This was at the Polo Grounds. This was, one of the biggest fights of Robinson's career, because
Huge
it actually
crowd,
it had meaning all of a sudden.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, a Robinson fight had meaning again, because this guy just beat him from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So they could not afford Robinson to kill Turpin in the ring. And there's a quote from Turpin that he said to his brother Jackie, which sums up how he felt. Turpin himself, he said he thought he could have won if he had been allowed to continue. Years later, his brother Jackie wrote that he had said in his dressing room, "A champ is entitled to die in the ring before they take his title."
Yeah, pretty strong stuff, isn't it? I mean, obviously, it's quite to the point from Turpin, but that's the way he felt, and we do believe, yeah, you do make a good point about it weighing on the referee's mind, and it was in the culture at the time that people were concerned in the ring. Obviously, they don't want to see someone getting hurt in there. Also, floating about in the background, maybe it's conjecture. I don't know how much evidence you have to support this, but regarding some kind of mafia involvement, is there something you want to say about that as well, Sam?
Yeah, there's another sort of rumor and innuendo that some people believe that Turpin threw the fight because there was supposedly a lot of stuff going on before. There was lots of trouble. There was problems with Turpin's fans flying over there, getting to the Polo Ground to support him. There was 2 planes of fans flying over to New York, and there was supposedly some delays and lots of trouble with that people believed maybe whoever was around Robinson had something to do with it. And there's these rumors that the mafia had involvement, and I'll just read this segment from my book again.
Mm-hmm.
There's been persistent suggestions that Turpin, afraid of the power of the mafia, had indeed thrown the fight. The story as told by Clark Meller, who worked as a wrestler with Turpin, was that Randolph had told him that night before the fight that a man dressed in a striped suit, black shirt, and a white tie had threatened Turpin, saying there would be 4 men dressed like him at ringside, and Turpin would not leave the arena alive if he won. Turpin, of course, denied this if ever asked if he threw the fight.
I mean, one thing I will say about that, obviously we talk about possibly thrown fights or fights that are ended in suspicious circumstances, looking at Ali, Liston, and then comparing it with this. If you're going to throw a fight, you think there would be a lot easier ways than the way Turpin went, to the conclusion in the 10th round.
Yeah. But it's just funny how, the 2 fights, the first one, Robinson was surrounded by a circus. He didn't train. Whether he wanted to try or not, we don't know. He went in there not in peak condition and he lost. And then in the second fight, Turpin had been swept up in this sudden overnight fame. He wasn't training properly either. He was partying. He did not prepare at all compared to the first fight. And then when he got to America, supposedly there were lots of people there planted, that were waiting for him to make sure he had a good time and wasn't thinking about the fight. There were lots of women, and, his brother reports about there would be women waiting everywhere they went that seemed like they'd been conveniently put there to, for when Turpin would arrive. And Turpin loved the ladies. He couldn't resist.
Yeah, he certainly did. Just to start wrapping things up then, Sam, obviously there were parallels between the 2 guys, between Sugar Ray Robinson and Randy Turpin in their after post-retirement, the rest of their lives really. Both ended up, I'd say, skint, I suppose, for want of a better word. The money just wasn't flowing for different reasons, for various reasons, actually. And I mean, me and Andy did speak about, obviously, Turpin's end was pretty horrific. But if you want to say a quick word on both guys, particularly Randy, about how their lives ended up after boxing.
Yeah, I mean, they both ended up penniless. It's just such a shame, particularly Robinson. I mean, the amount of money he made and he ended up with nothing. They both had, evidence of brain damage pretty much from just taking too much punishment and going on too long. Turpin was he never coped. He the book I read kind of emphasizes that Turpin, he always wanted to be rich again, and he felt like he could get his money back. And it's a problem with people who, when they've experienced fame and riches, living without it and being normal again is just incredibly difficult. He would always spend more than he had. He never saved anything. If you the documentary I mentioned on YouTube as well, they talk about, every time they talk about Turpin and money, it was spend. And yeah, his end it's kind of, what's out in the public domain is that he supposedly shot his 2-year-old daughter, then shot himself in the head. It didn't manage to kill himself. I think the bullet just lodged in his skull, and then he shot himself in the heart. And the daughter was in hospital for a couple of weeks and made a full recovery. So that's what is mostly out there. But actually in the book, because he speaks to some of the close family and he speaks to the daughter, and the family kind of don't believe he did that. Either they don't want to believe it, or because apparently there was evidence that Turpin was paranoid that he wasn't going to be around much longer. He owed money to people in London, the London mafia or mob or whatever they were. And he thought they were coming for him. And his family believes, some of his family, I must say, not all of them, believe that someone from the mob came into the house and shot their daughter and shot him. So there is that conspiracy, and the family don't hold anything against him. They're very fond of Randolph and his memory, and they continue to make appearances to this day. Because there's still his bar is still in Wales. You can still go and visit it. There's all his memorabilia and stuff is up there, and they often the family will go up there and make appearances, and they're all very happy to talk about him, and they're very fond of him, including his daughter. She's attended things, the one he's supposedly shot. So, because I've had Turpin as my Twitter picture ever since I joined, like 8-9 years ago. I don't know how long I've been on Twitter, and I have had a couple of people over the years, like hardcore boxing fans, kind of, oh, why have you got him as your picture? Yeah, he shot his daughter.
Really? Yeah.
And that's a lot of people kind of judge Turpin and don't want it. That's why he doesn't get mentioned much, because of how his life ended. People don't want to dig into the history of Randolph Turpin. But the way I look at it is his family have forgiven him. So who are we to judge him?
Yes. So you think that the way it ended, whatever happened, has sort of maybe tainted, the memory of even what came before in his career?
That's why I think he barely gets mentioned, and because it's one of the best wins ever for a British fighter. On paper, I mean, there's a lot of things you can pick holes in, but it's an incredible win. He beat Sugar Ray Robinson, but because of the way his life ended, I think that's why one of the reasons it does not get mentioned much, and we don't have Sky Sports doing a special on Randolph Turpin or whatever, and when they could.
Yeah, you mentioned the bar, and also there's documentaries and stuff. I mean, has there been, like, I believe there's a statue erected somewhere? Is there like streets named after him, things like that?
It's I don't know about a street, but if you want to see the statue, it's in Warwick Town Centre. It's a good place to visit, actually. There's a lot of like nice bars and restaurants, and it's just a little square, and the statue's in the middle. So it's a nice day out if you're ever in the area.
I might plan on going and having a look at that then. And in and around his native Leamington Spa, what's the sort of, I mean, they're relatives of his maybe still going?
Yeah, there are. They're quite a big family. I mean, I know one of his great-grandchildren or grandchildren, it must be great-grandchildren, trains in Coventry at the moment at one of the gyms, trains with the likes of like Troy James and what's his name? There was a guy who fought on Sky Sports not that long ago. I can't remember his name. Joe Sheriff.
Oh, right, yes.
Yeah, he there's a Turpin that trains at the gym with them, and his nephew is an old man now, Jackie Turpin. He's still happy to talk about him, and my cousin recently looked after him in hospital. So yeah, you still hear about the Turpins. They're still kind of on the scene. They're a famous boxing family. There was actually a gym at Warwick Racecourse until a couple of years ago that was running quite a few years. That was run by the Turpin. It was called Turpin's ABC. That was run by his family, but that's gone now. I'm not sure where they are now.
Yeah, I suppose his legacy does live on in some respect then, I suppose. And then just taking it full circle, obviously we heard right at the beginning, our friend, the gentleman, writing in, giving him no chance to boxing news and all that. But someone must have given him a chance, I suppose. And he's obviously a fighter. You said you've got him on your Twitter handle, and that personally for you is obviously, I suppose a hero of sorts, really, just to sum up.
Yeah. I've just always had an interest in him. Basically, when I first started getting into boxing, when you start to realize you've crossed over, and you're not just some casual boxing fan anymore. You want to dig deep and you want to learn. And there's so much to learn. There's just you could never go through the entire history of boxing. And yeah, I think I decided. I thought, I wonder if there's any good local fighters from the Coventry area. And apart from the guy who Amir Khan fought, I can't remember his name. There wasn't a lot. Errol Christie, I think he was from around here, the great amateur.
Wasn't Richie Everett from there?
Possibly. You'll know the British, the sort of domestic guys better than me. I'm not sure on that, but Turpin was the big name that came up. because he fought a lot in Coventry. A lot of his fights were in Coventry and Birmingham, and you know, I remembered my granddad talking about him when I was a kid, and it didn't mean anything to me back then. So yeah, I just took an interest in him when I started getting into boxing, and you know, I've read books, and it's a very fascinating story. And I always say, if there was any fighter that could have a great film made about him, it's Randolph Turpin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's had a bit of everything, didn't it? What you would want to see in a movie,
He became
really.
a wrestler as well. That amount, I mean, you've got that whole other side of after his life, after his boxing career, he was a wrestler on the British scene. He wrestled for years. And I mean, like sort of pro wrestling, like the WWE stuff. So it's all sort of entertainment, not actual wrestling.
And his physique would have turned itself to that type of thing, probably, wouldn't it?
He was built for it. The only problem he had was he wasn't a draw as a wrestler, because the problem Turpin always has, he couldn't really talk well. He was not a good talker. If you watch the videos of him, you know, he's got these thousands of people in front of him in the streets of Leamington. He's on the balcony, he gets on the mic, you know, this is your moment. You imagine the sort of thing someone like Ali would have said, and he's just like, thanks a lot, you know, thanks for everyone for coming. You know, he's just, you know, he's just got nothing to say. He wasn't that type of person. He wasn't charismatic at all. He was just a tip. I mean, it cracks me up because I know so many people just like him, you know, typical Midlanders, and they ain't got.
So do I.
Yeah, you know the type. Very simple, happy people, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks for coming on, and especially for, you know, trawling through the archives and finding all these nuggets of information. This is the perfect fight for a Punches from the Past episode. It really has fitted in well. You mentioned your Twitter there earlier on. Do you want to go through the bits and pieces against the ropes? Tell us what's going on, where people can find you on social media.
Yeah, if you want to. The big account is ATR Boxing UK on Twitter. That's the Against the Ropes main account. I do most of the tweeting on there. And then on Facebook, we're facebook.com/ATRBox. And that's like, yeah, that's a massive page on Facebook, one of the biggest. It's always worth going on there if you don't already follow us. My personal Twitter is Samuel ATR UK. That's a bit more mixed. I don't just tweet about boxing. So yeah, if you want to follow me, that's where I am.
Yeah, if you want to know anything more about Sam, we have spoken to him in the past, as you'll know, in one of the In Conversation with episodes as well, which is on the Patreon list. All that I can say is thanks very much for joining us. To everybody who's been listening as well, I've been Steve Wellings. Thanks, Sam. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. You're always welcome to come back anytime.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been good. It's been enjoyable. I've enjoyed researching Turpin again and brushing up on my knowledge. It's always interesting.
As a fighter, Mr. Turpin is about one of the best that I've ever met. As a gentleman, he's a wonderful fellow. Those of you who haven't had the pleasure of knowing him, Randy is one of the most regular guys that you ever want to meet. I only hope that he'll have as enjoyable time here in America, in New York, as I had while I was in England. And I would love to have an opportunity to show him around here in New York City.